What if I told you that Rome's greatest weapon was not the sword, but the shovel? It was thanks to the shovel that the legions created something that inspired awe throughout the empire. The Roman military camp, or castrum. It was not just a temporary bivouac, but a perfectly tuned mechanism, a fortress city that could spring up in the middle of a hostile desert or dense forest in just a few hours. Life within this perimeter was not subject to the chaos of war, but to an ironclad routine where every cog knew its place. Watch the video to the end to learn how thousands of people lived within this mechanism, how daily routine became the key to survival, and why these camps were a true reflection of Roman genius. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Roman army, which had nothing to do with combat tactics. That secret is unification. Whether set up in foggy Britain, hot Syria, or forested Germany, Roman camps were built according to the same strict blueprint. This had enormous psychological significance for every soldier who spent years away from home. A legionnaire transferred to the other end of the empire found himself in a completely familiar environment. He instinctively knew where the centurion's tent was, where the armory was, and where the main gate was. This predictability created a sense of home and stability amid chaos and uncertainty. No matter what foreign land a legionnaire set foot on, in the evening he returned to an orderly, understandable, and safe world. The camp was a microcosm of Rome, which they carried with them on the tips of their spears and on their shovels. This standardization was not just a military necessity, but a powerful tool for maintaining morale and discipline. Every element of the camp, from the location of the toilets to the width of the streets, was calculated and approved. Engineers and surveyors, known as grammatici, were among the most respected people in the legion. They were responsible for accurately recreating the standard plan on any terrain. Their work required a deep knowledge of geometry and topography, as any error in their calculations could disrupt the entire well-oiled machine. This precision and meticulousness in everything distinguished the Roman army from any other army of the time. The camp itself was a symbol of Roman power and unshakable order. Its straight lines, sharp angles, and powerful fortifications demonstrated not only military strength, but also the superiority of Roman civilization. For local tribes accustomed to chaotic settlements, the sight of such a perfect rectangle, built in half a day, was a demonstration of almost divine power. This was a civilization that had come to stay. This standardization also had enormous practical significance. In case of alarm, every soldier knew exactly where to run and which section of the perimeter to defend. There was no confusion or disorder, which were fatal in defense. Every centurion knew the exact location of his cohort, and the commander could instantly assess the situation. Thus, the Roman camp was not just a place to sleep, but a continuation of Roman ideology. It was an ideology of order, efficiency, and total control over space and time. Every ditch and every palisade was a material embodiment of Roman law brought to the wildlands. This was their main secret. 10 rows of tents, separated by straight passages, formed a cohort. 10 such cohorts made up a legion. This mathematical precision permeated all spheres of life. Soldiers lived in a world where everything was subject to numbers and functions. This system excluded individuality, but in return gave a sense of belonging to something great and indestructible. A legionnaire was not just a warrior, he was a builder and bearer of this order. His life in the camp was a daily ritual that confirmed this idea. This predictability also applied to everyday life. Soldiers knew exactly when they would receive their ration of grain, when it was time to sharpen their tools, and when to stand guard. This rhythm of life was calming and did not give soldiers too much time for idle reflection. What do you think about this psychological approach to organizing army life? Was this total order beneficial for the soldier, or did it oppress him? Write about it in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new research on everyday life in ancient times. Want to know the secret that allowed the legion to disappear in one place and reappear in another in full combat readiness? The answer lies in incredible mobility and engineering training. Every day of the Legion's march ended with the construction of a fortified camp. Even if the stop was planned for just one night, thousands of people set to work, turning an empty field into a fortress. But before digging the first shovel into the ground, it was necessary to choose the perfect location. Choosing a location was a science in itself, carried out by special surveyors, grommetici, or castramentori. They were sent ahead of the main column, accompanied by cavalry cover, to assess the terrain. The main criterion was access to vital resources. First and foremost, this was clean water. A river, stream, or at least a place where wells could be easily dug. Without water, the Legion could not survive for a single day. The second important resource was wood. Wood was needed in huge quantities to build the camp itself. It was used to make palisades, vallum, towers, gates, and as fuel for cooking and heating. Therefore, they tried to set up camp near a forest. The third factor was topography. The ideal location had to have natural advantages for defense. Camps were often set up on a hillside, which provided a good view and made it difficult for potential enemies to approach. They tried to avoid lowlands that could be flooded by rain, as well as places surrounded by dense thickets or high ground from which the camp could be seen. Once the location had been chosen, the grommetici began marking it out. They used a special tool, a gramma, which was a cross on a pole with plumb lines. With its help, they measured perfectly straight angles. First, the central point of the future camp was determined. From this point, two main streets were measured, intersecting at right angles. These were Via Principalis, Main Street, and Via Praetoria, Praetorian Street. Around this intersection, squares were marked out like a template for the headquarters, the commander's tents, and then the quarters for the cohorts and sentries. All the markings were made with poles and colored flags. When the main column of the Legion approached the chosen location, the soldiers already had a marked-out plan waiting for them. They did not need to think about where to pitch their tents or dig a trench. Each centurion led his unit to his assigned sector, and work began immediately. The march itself was no less organized than life in the camp. The Legion did not move in a disorderly crowd, but in a strict column. Each soldier carried an impressive load called muli mariani. It included personal equipment, tools, stakes for the palisade, and a supply of provisions for several days. The total weight of the equipment could reach 40 kilograms. The soldiers carried this load on a special T-shaped pole called a furca. This allowed the load to be distributed evenly and quickly dropped if necessary. This system made the Legion independent of the baggage train on short marches. Discipline on the march was ironclad. Strict distances were maintained, and stops were made only on command. Scouts constantly combed the terrain ahead and on the flanks to prevent the column from encountering unforeseen situations. The Roman Legion on the march was a living, moving fortress. Which element of camp planning do you think is most important for the survival of the Legion? But how did they manage to build an entire fortress before sunset? In the next chapter, we will reveal the incredible secrets of Roman construction. What I'm about to show you breaks all preconceptions about ancient construction. Imagine this: a legion of 5,000 men, after an exhausting day's march, weighed down with baggage, arrives at an empty, barely marked field, and in just 3 or 4 hours, a full-fledged fortress stands on this site, surrounded by a moat, a rampart, and a palisade. This incredible speed was achieved thanks to ingenious organization of labor and specialization. As soon as the legionnaires arrived at the site, the work was immediately divided up. About 2/3 of the legion, having thrown down their baggage, immediately took up shovels, pickaxes, and axes. These were their main construction tools, which they always carried with them. The remaining third of the legion lined up in full gear to guard the perimeter while their comrades worked. The first task was to dig a trench, or fosse. This was not just a ditch, but a serious engineering structure. Temporary camps usually had a V-shaped ditch, about 3 meters deep and up to 4 meters wide. Thousands of people working shoulder to shoulder simultaneously dug into the ground around the entire perimeter of the future camp. All the earth extracted from the trench was not scattered, but neatly laid on the inside. It was used to form a powerful earthen rampart known as an agger. This rampart served as the foundation for the main fortification, the vallum. It not only increased the height of the barrier, but also created a convenient platform for the defenders. While the moat was being dug, another group of soldiers went to the nearest forest. Their task was to prepare stakes for the vallum. Each legionnaire carried 2 or 3 sharpened stakes. But for a full-fledged camp, thousands of such stakes were needed, which were driven into the crest of the earthen rampart. These stakes, tightly set and often intertwined, formed a continuous, impenetrable palisade. It was a simple but extremely effective defense. The structure was so strong that it could withstand a serious attack. The work was carried out at an incredible pace and with remarkable coordination. Every soldier knew exactly what his task was. There was no room for delay or error. Centurions and legates supervised the process, ensuring that all work was carried out in strict accordance with the plan. While the fortifications were being built, another kind of life was already bustling inside the camp. Soldiers from the contubernia pitched their leather tents, papilio. They were set up in strictly designated areas, in neat rows forming streets. At the same time, tents for officers and a headquarters tent were pitched. The camp gates also received special attention. There were 4 of them, 1 on each side. The gates were additionally fortified and often had wooden towers on the sides for observers. Sometimes a clever system called a clavicula was used to protect the entrance, an internal rounded rampart that forced anyone entering to turn sideways, making them vulnerable. By sunset, the camp was ready. The moat was dug, the rampart was built, the palisade was erected, and the tents were pitched. The legion was completely safe. This ability to create a fortress out of nothing, using only muscle power and simple tools, was one of Rome's main tactical advantages. If you like this detailed analysis of ancient technologies, please give it a thumbs up. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos about survival in ancient Rome. Are you ready to learn the truth about how navigation worked inside this military city? A Roman camp was not just a collection of tents behind a fence, but a carefully planned urban space. It was based on a simple and ingenious grid system, similar to that used in Roman cities. This system provided instant orientation and rapid movement of troops. As we have already mentioned, the camp was based on 2 main intersecting streets. Via Principalis, Main Street, ran across the camp and connected the 2 side gates. It was very wide, which allowed troops to be quickly transferred from one flank to another. The tents of senior officers and tribunes were located along this street. Perpendicular to it was Via Praetoria, which led from the main gate, Porta Praetoria, Praetorian Gate, to the center of the camp. Through this gate, the camp always faced the most likely route of movement. It was through this gate that the legion marched out or assembled. The intersection of these 2 streets formed the central square of the camp. This is where the headquarters, or Principia, was located. Behind the headquarters on the same axis as Via Praetoria was Via Decumanus, which led to the rear gate, Porta Decumanus. This gate was considered the least honorable. Prisoners were usually let out through it, or waste was taken out. The rest of the camp was divided into equal rectangular quarters, called strigae. These quarters were separated by narrower streets parallel to the main ones. This layout was incredibly efficient. In case of an alarm sounded by a trumpeter, a centuria could assemble and reach its section of the rampart in a matter of minutes without causing any confusion. The legionnaires' tents were arranged in neat rows in these strigas. Each cohort occupied its own quarter, and within it, each centuria had its own row. The tents were placed very close together, with the entrance facing the passageway. At the end of each row stood the centurion's tent, which was slightly larger than the soldiers' tents. This organization reflected the very structure of the legion. The commander, looking at the camp plan, could tell exactly where any of the 60 sentries were located. Soldiers lived, ate, and slept as part of their unit, which strengthened corporate spirit and mutual assistance. An important feature was that a wide open space was left between the tents and the inner slope of the rampart. It was called the intervallum. This space served several functions. First, it protected the tents from projectiles that could fly over the rampart. Second, it served as a ring road for the rapid transfer of reserves to any section of the perimeter. The intervallum was also often used to house auxiliary services. It could contain field kitchens, toilets, latrines, and places for keeping pack animals. Latrines were simple but deep pits that were regularly cleaned to maintain hygiene. This ingenious and simple layout was the key to maintaining order. It transformed 5,000 armed men into a single coordinated organism. Each soldier was part of his 10 contubernium. The 10 was part of a centuria, the centuria was part of a cohort, and the cohort was part of a legion. And this structure was literally imprinted on the ground in the form of streets and quarters of the camp. Is such precision and pedantry surprising for the ancient world? In the next chapter, we will go to the very heart of the camp, where access was not open to everyone. At the center of every Roman camp, at the intersection of the main streets, was its administrative and spiritual brain. This was the place known as the Principia, or headquarters. This complex of buildings was the heart of the entire camp, and access to it was strictly regulated. It was from here that the legate or prefect commanded the entire legion, and it was here that the most important symbols were kept. The Principia was a large rectangular complex, open to the inside. A monumental entrance led from Via Principalis into a large open courtyard. This courtyard was surrounded by a colonnade and served as a place for morning roll calls, the distribution of orders, and official ceremonies. Here the commander could address his centurions. Behind the courtyard was the main building of the complex, the Basilica. It was a large covered hall, similar to those used in cities for courts and commerce. In the camp, the Basilica served as a place for meetings in bad weather, as well as a place where justice was administered. Officers could gather here to discuss plans. Along the far wall of the Basilica was a row of small rooms. These were the offices of the camp bureaucracy. Here sat the scribes, liberi, who kept track of personnel, compiled lists for the payment of salaries, and recorded the receipt and expenditure of food supplies. The Roman army was incredibly bureaucratic, and every nail was accounted for. In the very center of this row of rooms was the most sacred place in the camp, the Cecellum, or sanctuary. Here, under heavy guard, were kept the standards of the legion and its cohorts, including the main eagle, Aquila. These standards were not just banners, but objects of religious worship, embodying the honor and spirit of the legion. The loss of the eagle was considered the greatest disgrace, so the Cecellum was the most heavily guarded place. Next to the sanctuary, often in the basement below it, was the legion's treasury. Here were kept chests with the soldiers' pay, as well as their personal savings, which they deposited for safekeeping. To the side of the Principia, usually on the right, was the Praetorium, the private residence of the legion commander, the legate. It was not just a tent, but a full-fledged house. Even in a temporary camp, the Praetorium was an impressive structure with several rooms, a private courtyard, and often even a small bathhouse. This house served not only as a residence for the legate and his family, but also as a place to receive important guests or local leaders. The luxury of the Praetorium was intended to demonstrate the status and wealth of Rome. Here the legate held military councils with his senior officers, tribunes, and senior centurion, the Primipalus. On the other side of the Principia, there could be houses of other senior officers, tribunes. They were also much more comfortable than soldiers' tents, emphasizing the strict hierarchy that prevailed in the legion. The entire central part of the camp was an administrative city, separated from the soldiers' sleeping areas. Thus, the center of the camp was its nervous system. This is where all the threads of command converged, where decisions were made, money and symbols of honor were kept. The daily life of an ordinary legionnaire rarely intersected with this place, but his entire existence in the camp was guided by orders emanating from the Principia. What if I told you that a legionnaire's personal space was smaller than you can imagine? The daily life of an ordinary soldier took place in the smallest unit of the legion, the contubernium. It was a group of 8 men who lived, ate, worked, and fought together. They were a real army family, and their home was a single leather tent. This tent, known as a papilio because of its shape, which resembled butterfly wings, was extremely cramped. 8 fully equipped adult men had to share a space of only about 10 square meters. There was no question of privacy here. The soldiers slept shoulder to shoulder on straw mattresses or simply on the ground. The tents were set up in rows called strigae. Each strigae housed 1 centuria, consisting of 10 contubernia. The space between the tents was minimal, just enough to walk through. The soldiers kept their personal equipment either inside the tent or outside under the canopy formed by the roof slopes. Each contubernium was a self-sufficient unit. They had a common pot for cooking food, a hand mill for grain, and one mule which carried the tent and common equipment on the march. The soldiers took turns caring for this mule. This shared responsibility united the group. In the morning, the soldiers woke up to the sound of a trumpet long before dawn. The first thing they did was to tidy up their equipment and tents. Discipline demanded perfect cleanliness. After that, the soldiers received their daily ration of grain. This was usually unhusked grain, most often wheat or barley. The most tedious daily task was grinding this grain. Each contubernium had its own hand-operated rotary mill. The soldiers took turns turning the heavy stone millstone to obtain coarse flour. This process took a lot of time and effort, but it was mandatory. The soldiers used the flour to prepare their main food. Most often it was a thick porridge or soup. Water and salt were added to the flour and cooked in a common pot. If possible, vegetables, beans, or pieces of bacon were added to the porridge. It was a simple but very high-calorie and filling meal that provided energy for hard work. Sometimes bread was baked from flour. It was unleavened, hard army bread known as panis militaris. It was baked either in small clay ovens built next to the tents or simply on hot stones. Such bread was hard and did not spoil for a long time. Mealtimes were as communal as the rest of life. 8 soldiers would sit around a shared pot and eat from their bowls. These moments of shared meals were an important part of social life, a time for conversation and exchanging news. Living in such cramped conditions required enormous patience and the ability to get along with others. Arguments and conflicts in the contubernium were inevitable, but they were resolved within the group or with the help of the senior member of the tent, the decanus. The survival of the group depended on the harmony of these 8 men. Could you live in such conditions of constant crowding and lack of personal space? But what exactly did these soldiers eat, besides porridge, to maintain their incredible strength? We will discuss this in detail in the next chapter. The Roman legionnaires' diet was based not on luxury, but on functionality. Food had to be high in calories, cheap, easy to transport, and long-lasting. The main product that met all these requirements was grain or frumentum. Each legionnaire received a daily ration of grain, which, as we already know, he ground and cooked himself. The grain diet was the basis of the Roman army. Wheat, barley, or spelt provided soldiers with the carbohydrates they needed for long marches and heavy construction work. Roman commanders believed that soldiers who ate grain were more resilient than those who ate a lot of meat. Meat was considered a supplement, not a staple food. In addition to porridge, pulses, and panis bread, other foods were also included in the diet. An important source of protein was cheese, usually hard and salty, which could be stored for weeks. Soldiers also received legumes, lentils, and beans, which were often added to soup. Vegetables were also part of the diet, although they depended on the season and the location of the legion. Onions, garlic, and cabbage were the most common. They were valued not only for their taste, but also for their health benefits. Salt was an absolutely essential product, and it was distributed regularly and in sufficient quantities. As for beverages, the legionnaires' main drink was not water, but pasca. It was a drink made from water and sour wine or wine vinegar. Pasca was cheap, perfectly quenched thirst, and, most importantly, had disinfectant properties due to its acidity. Drinking pasca instead of raw water from untested sources helped maintain hygiene. Supplying the legion with food was a complex logistical task. Each legion had a huge convoy consisting of hundreds of mules and carts that transported supplies of grain, wine, and other provisions. Managing this convoy required no less skill than managing the legion itself. During long campaigns, the legion could not rely solely on supplies from Rome. Food was purchased from the local population, either for money or in the form of taxes. Sometimes foragers, special detachments, were sent out in search of grain and livestock. In permanent camps, castra stativa, the situation was different. Over time, entire settlements, canabai, grew up around them, where merchants, craftsmen, and soldiers' families lived. Here, legionaries could buy more varied food with their pay, fresh fruit, honey, or even go to a local tavern. Soldiers also tried to diversify their diet on their own. If circumstances allowed, they could hunt or fish. In stationary camps, they often planted small vegetable gardens where they grew greens and vegetables for their contubernium. Thus, the legionnaires' diet was simple but balanced. It was designed to maintain maximum physical endurance. The supply system, although cumbersome, worked like clockwork, providing thousands of people with everything they needed, even in the most remote corners of the empire. Life in the camp was governed not by the sun, but by the sounds of trumpets. From dawn to late at night, the daily routine was regulated by a series of musical signals. These signals, played by cornucorns, who played the cornohorn, and tuba players, who played the straight tuba, were a universal language understood by every soldier. They announced wake-up, assembly, meals, the start of work, and the changing of the guard. The day in the camp began long before sunrise with the reveille. This signal woke the soldiers and gave them time for their morning toilet and to tidy up their equipment. This was followed by other signals regulating morning formations and the start of various tasks. In the evening, a special signal announced lights out and the onset of silence. One of the most important and responsible duties in the camp was guard duty, or vigilia. The camp never slept. The safety of thousands of people depended on the vigilance of the sentries. Guard duty was organized with mathematical precision. The entire night was divided into 4 watches, or vigils, each lasting 3 hours. New units took over each watch. Guards were stationed around the entire perimeter of the rampart, on the towers and at the gates. Inside the camp, there were also patrols that maintained order and prevented fires. To ensure that the sentries did not fall asleep on duty, there was a complex system of inspections. Every night, several cavalry patrols, equites, rode around the perimeter. They checked the vigilance of the sentries. Falling asleep on duty was considered one of the most serious offenses and was severely punished. A key element of security was the password system. Every day, a new password was announced at headquarters, the Principio. It was written on a special wooden tablet, a tessera. The tesseraire, the junior officer in each centuria, was responsible for communicating the password to his soldiers going on guard duty. Anyone approaching the camp or moving around it at night had to give the correct password. This system was simple but very effective. It prevented outsiders from entering and helped to identify spies. The camp gates were an area of particular attention. During the day, they were open, but there was always a strong guard checking everyone entering and leaving. At night, the gates were securely locked and barricaded. They could only be opened on the orders of a senior officer. This constant vigilance was not paranoia, but a necessity of life. Roman camps were often located in hostile territory, and a sudden attack could occur at any moment. The system of guards and signals turned the camp into a sensitive organism, ready to respond instantly to any threat. A soldier's life was permeated by this routine. Standing guard was as integral a part of his service as marching or construction work. He may not have liked those cold night hours on the ramparts, but he understood that the lives of the entire contubernium and the entire legion depended on his eyes. Thus, the sounds of trumpets and the vigilance of the sentries were woven into a single system that ensured order and security. This system was an invisible shield that surrounded the camp around the clock. The Roman camp was designed as a completely autonomous organism, capable of existing in isolation for weeks or even months. To this end, not only residential tents and headquarters were located within its perimeter, but also entire production complexes. This was the so-called factory, camp workshops where skilled craftsmen from among the soldiers worked. Not only infantrymen served in the legion. Among the legionnaires were many specialists, blacksmiths, carpenters, tanners, armorers, and engineers. These people, known as immunes, were exempt from certain daily duties, such as digging trenches, in order to focus on their work. They were highly valued personnel. The factory was bustling with activity. Blacksmiths and field forges repaired tools, shoed mules, and straightened bent pieces of armor. Carpenters made tool handles, repaired cartwheels, and built siege engines when the legion was preparing for an assault. Leather workers repaired tents, shoes, and equipment straps. The presence of such workshops allowed the legion to be independent of supplies from Rome. Any breakdown could be repaired on the spot. This made the army incredibly flexible and resilient. The factory was the technological heart of the camp, ensuring the smooth operation of the entire military machine. Another important facility in the camp was the valetudinarium, or hospital. The Romans understood the importance of hygiene and medical care in maintaining the Army's combat readiness. In permanent camps, the valetudinarium was a large, well-organized stone building. Even in temporary camps, special tents were set aside for it in the quietest place. The hospital was built in a corridor style, with rows of small wards designed to accommodate several patients. This allowed patients to be isolated and kept clean. In the center of the complex was a courtyard for walking, as well as operating rooms, dressing rooms, and rooms for storing medicines. The hospital was headed by a medicus, or chief physician of the Legion. He was assisted by junior doctors, capsari, orderlies who carried dressing bags, and other staff. Roman military medicine was surprisingly advanced for its time. Doctors were able to perform fairly complex operations and had a large set of surgical instruments at their disposal. Special attention was paid to prevention. The valetudinarius was responsible not only for treatment, but also for general hygiene in the camp. Doctors monitored the quality of water and food and controlled the cleanliness of latrines and baths. In permanent camps, thermal baths were a mandatory element that helped soldiers maintain personal hygiene. The sewage system in permanent camps was also up to par. Stone channels carried sewage and waste outside the camp, which was a key factor in preventing the spread of disease. The Romans understood the connection between cleanliness and health earlier than many others. Thus, the presence of a factory and a valetudinarium transformed the camp from a simple military encampment into a real city. It could repair itself, treat itself, and provide for itself. This self-sufficiency was another pillar on which the power of the Roman army rested. Perhaps the most important element that permeated life in the camp was discipline. It was not just a word, but a fundamental concept on which the entire Roman army was built. Without it, there would be no order, no strength, and no victories. Discipline was the invisible framework that transformed a crowd of people into an invincible machine. It was felt in everything, in the movements, in the speech, in the very breath of a soldier. Even the gait of a legionnaire had to be measured and confident, as if he were Mars himself. It was not just a requirement, but a way of life. From the very morning, from the moment the bugler announced the rising, everyone knew their task. Discipline filled the day with meaning and order. It set the rhythm for everything, from how a soldier made his straw bed to how he put on his sword belt. Every step, every action mattered, because chaos was the enemy of Roman order. Discipline was the glue that held thousands of people together, forcing them to act as a single organism. When thousands of feet marched in unison, it was not just a march, it was a manifestation of the will of the empire. Even if a legionnaire grew tired, he knew that his comrade was walking beside him, and that to stop would be to let the formation down. This is how the spirit of unity was formed, without which the army would have turned into a helpless gathering. It manifested itself in everything, from the perfectly clean buckle on the belt to instant obedience to the bugle call. Even in the smallest details lay strength, for it is the small things that distinguish order from disorder. The centurion could notice any negligence: a poorly fastened fibula, a dirty belt, a loose buckle. Everything had to be perfect, because appearance reflected inner readiness. The daily routine was scheduled down to the minute. Every dawn began the same way: rising, inspection, breakfast, formation. Legionnaires had virtually no free time. During their rare hours of rest, soldiers repaired their clothes, cleaned their equipment, or helped their comrades. In the Roman army, idleness was considered the enemy of the spirit, and work was the cure for despondency. If a soldier was not busy with construction work, on guard duty, or on a campaign, he had to train. These training sessions, exercitium, were daily, exhausting, and endless. They developed endurance, strength, and a habit of obedience. Even veterans who had been through dozens of campaigns continued to train, setting an example for the young. Training took place on a special field outside the camp, which was called the campus. It was a flat area cleared of rocks and bushes. Here, under the scorching sun, soldiers carried out the orders of instructors who knew no mercy. They marched until their feet burned with pain and their breathing became ragged. Here, soldiers practiced marching in full gear, covering dozens of kilometers. Their armor weighed dozens of kilograms, but no one was allowed to complain. Each step strengthened their bodies and willpower. They learned not only to walk, but also to maintain formation, keeping equal intervals and rhythm of steps, even on rough terrain. They practiced forming and reforming formations, mastering complex maneuvers such as the famous turtle to the point of automatism. This exercise required absolute harmony between the soldiers. Everyone had to trust each other because the life of the entire unit depended on the slightest mistake. Numerous training sessions turned them into a single organism, where everyone knew their place. Individual skills were also practiced. Soldiers fenced with wooden swords and threw training darts. These swords were heavier than real ones to make training seem more difficult than actual combat. After such exercises, a real gladius seemed light and the enemy seemed slow. This is how the Romans prepared themselves for real combat, where there was no room for error. These exercises were aimed not so much at teaching combat as at maintaining the highest level of physical fitness and endurance. A legionnaire had to be ready to run a mile in armor, set up fortifications, and immediately engage in combat. A Roman soldier could not afford weakness. He was a machine of flesh and steel, created by discipline and constant work. A Roman legionnaire was, first and foremost, a professional athlete. He ate modestly, slept little, but his body was trained to the limit. Unlike the barbarians, who relied on fury, the Romans won with cold calculation and training. Even their movements were precise, as if every blow had been calculated in advance. Construction skills were also constantly honed. Every legionnaire had to be able to not only fight, but also build. The legions regularly practiced setting up temporary camps. Competitions were held between centurions to see who could dig their section of the moat or erect the palisade faster. This turned hard work into a competition, developing speed, coordination, and mutual assistance. At the same time, every little detail mattered. The moat had to be perfectly straight, the tent had to be stretched without wrinkles, and the earthen embankment had to be of uniform height. A mistake of a few inches could provoke the centurion's anger, but it was precisely because of such exacting standards that Roman camps always looked perfect, a reflection of the empire itself. Discipline also meant unconditional obedience to orders. The hierarchy in the legion was absolute. The contubernium obeyed its decanus, the decanus obeyed the centurion obeyed the tribune, and the tribune obeyed the legate. An order given by a superior was not discussed but carried out immediately. Even if it seemed pointless, the soldier was obliged to act. The centurions were responsible for maintaining order. They were the backbone of the army, experienced soldiers who had risen from the ranks. Everyone knew them by their voice, gait, and gaze. A single shout from a centurion could silence 100 men. They were personally responsible for the training, daily life, and morale of their centuria. The centurion's authority was unquestionable. His word was law. He ate with the same soldiers, slept in the same tents, but remained above them because he was an example. The centurion could punish, but he could also praise, and such praise was valued more than any award. He was respected not out of fear, but for his fairness. Even everyday tasks were part of discipline. The daily cleaning of weapons and armor was not just a necessity, but a ritual. Every rivet, every plate of armor had to shine. Dirty equipment was considered a disgrace, as it symbolized carelessness and weakness of spirit. The equipment had to shine. When the ranks of soldiers came out for the morning inspection, their helmets reflected the sun like mirrors. This shine was not just external. It showed internal order and pride. The Romans believed that a well-maintained sword cuts more accurately, and clean armor protects better. A dirty tunic or rusty helmet was a sign of laziness and negligence, which immediately attracted the attention of the centurion. The punishment for negligence could be severe, from deprivation of rations to public censure. But more often than not, the soldier was ashamed of himself, because letting down the legion was worse than any punishment. This system of total control and constant activity had a deep psychological meaning. Soldiers had no time for idleness, which could lead to a decline in morale or discontent. Their bodies and minds were constantly occupied with specific, understandable tasks. This formed an iron character capable of withstanding any hardship. Constant activity created a sense of purpose. Every day, the legionnaire knew that he was doing something important for Rome, even if it was just sharpening a spear or cleaning a sword. Discipline did not oppress, but gave confidence, because it brought order to a world in which chaos reigned. Life in the camp was, in essence, endless training. It was a school of endurance, obedience, and patience. Here they learned not only to fight, but also to live in the constant rhythm of service. Every day strengthened the body, spirit, and faith in the Legion. Legionnaires trained in endurance, obedience, coordination, and engineering skills until the last day of their service. They became not just warriors, but craftsmen of discipline. It was this discipline, not technological superiority, that made the Roman legion so effective. The camp was their school, home, and forge, where this unique type of soldier was forged. Within its walls, the power that held the empire together for centuries was born. And as long as these camps stood, Rome itself stood. We immersed ourselves in the daily life of a Roman camp and saw that it was not just a collection of tents, but a complex social and engineering mechanism. From the perfectly straight ditch dug in an hour to the strict sound of the trumpet dividing the day into segments, everything was subordinated to one goal: order. The life of a legionnaire was hard, cramped, and devoid of privacy, but it also gave him a sense of security, belonging to a great power, and confidence in the future. The Roman castrum was a mobile version of Rome itself, a fortress of civilization that the legions carried with them to the wildest corners of the known world. It was at once a home, a workshop, a hospital, and a school of discipline. It was this ability to organize itself and follow a strict routine, not just swords, that allowed Rome to build its empire. What other aspects of Roman history or everyday life in other eras would you like to see on our channel? Please suggest topics for future videos in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new research.